Okay, so my title is not this, although it appeared on the schedule as this. I guess this was Judith's talk yesterday, so not that. And I thought, oh, what should the title be? And I thought, maybe it's this, but it's not really that. It's really answering the so what question about environmental impacts. How do you answer the so what question? How many marine organisms do you have to kill for Republicans, for instance, to care? And so I'll spend 5 minutes on the precautionary principle. I assume everybody knows the precautionary principle, right? I guess it's pedagogically not correct to ask who doesn't know about the precautionary principle. That's dumb. So we'll just say a few words. It's the elevated to a political or moral principle, the idea of being better safe than sorry. And it has two parts. One is an obligation to anticipate harm before it occurs, and the second is an obligation to act to prevent or to minimize that harm. And in the case, even in the case when the scientific uncertainty prevents us from knowing its likelihood or even its size. And it was a changing of the rules of the game when it was first introduced, right? The idea is that the developer or the advocate for some action has now the burden of proof to show that the proposed action doesn't or won't cause significant harm. And the need for mitigation increases either with the magnitude of the possible harm or with the degree of uncertainty about whether it's going to happen. And it's, well, for 20 years it's been increasingly common. It's a basic tenet in environmentalism, it's compulsory in European law, and it's common in international treaties. This is a quote from the Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration. Precautionary principle is usually used strategically, really, to inhibit development of some kind, and that means it's usually invoked by environmentalists, the good guys. And some managers on the other side commonly ask me, how do we defend against the precautionary principle? Which is an interesting idea from my point of view as an environmentalist. I think, well, what do you mean defend against? But they argue that it really means that in large uncertainty, we can't do anything. Our hands are bound, and if there are no risks, how can there be progress? And of course, there are two essential elements to the precautionary principle. People don't real often say it like this, but really the first essential bit is that there must be uncertainty about the matter. Right? Without uncertainty, what's at stake would be clear to everyone, and negotiation and regular old horse trading would be able to resolve disputes. And it also has to be the case that the potential harm is high stakes, or at least irreversible in some sense. Without those high costs, again, there'd be no debate because nobody would worry about it, right? And it wouldn't be reasonable to justify shifting the burden or anything like that. But I think there is a defense, if you will, against the precautionary principle, and that's doing it better, right? Decision theory is a way to make optimal decisions given risks and costs, because it explicitly balances these different errors, the error of doing it and the error of not doing it, or rather the consequence of those different actions. And it can weight them by the respective costs. And the precautionary principle is really a non-quantitative way to acknowledge those differences in costs. It's really a non-quantitative way to do decision analysis, if you will, that's conservative in a particular direction. And so the take-home message that I try to tell students, at least, is that quantitative risk assessments can express the precautionary principle, and they can also overrule it. Of course, I agree with you, for instance, that balancing the errors and the costs is essential for sound decisions. It doesn't mean that we go one way necessarily, but at least we need to understand the balance of those risks and costs. Right? All right, so I want to talk about population-level risk analysis, and I've been doing that for a long, long time, longer than all of you, maybe longer than your collective age, I think. It seems that way. And it's relevant for all kinds of impacts. These are the impacts that commonly affect biological species on the planet in order of their magnitude, at least relative magnitudes, I think. So habitat loss is often considered the main one. And then, of course, there's harvesting and hunting and maybe chemical contamination. Maybe incidental mortality is above that or below that. It's not entirely clear. I think the Velella, if it's being harmed by the ocean cleanup, that would be incidental mortality. There's also thermal pollution, which is really important in electricity generation, for instance, and even radiological contamination. That wasn't a big deal until a few years ago. And I'm not exactly sure where plastics or microplastics would go on this list. It's not clear, to me at least, how large the impact of those contaminants is. Ecological risk analysis is, however, the tool that we have to use to figure that out, right? To answer that question. It measures the effects on biological systems and predicts future consequences, and it can be used by engineers to create minimal impact designs and to plan mitigation and remediation if necessary, and certainly to underwrite insurance and maybe do certifications and verifications and other technical things. And in the field of ecological risk analysis, there are really three emerging trends. I guess 20 years ago they were emerging. By now, let's say that they've emerged. These are the tenets, in a sense, of ecological risk analysis. The first is that we're generally going to be focusing on populations, and that's better than individuals and not as good, but practical compared to entire ecosystems. And that's really a practical thing. We can't really do much with ecosystems. Ecology as a science is sort of, well, it's pre-scientific. It doesn't have a good model for how ecosystems are put together. We can't really even express how the impacts are going to propagate through them. The second tenet is that we need to express these impacts in terms of a risk language. That is, express the impacts in a probabilistic language that engineers can use to balance risks against one another and to understand what that magnitude means in a risk-weighted sense, so that we can make those decisions I was talking about earlier. The third tenet is that we really ought to be computing cumulative but attributable risks, attributable effects. Those are the ones that are attributable to some action happening. So, everybody dies. All plants and animals die eventually, except maybe ferns, which weirdly are immortal. But typically, things die. And it's not a surprise that they die, and they're going to die anyway. And the question is, if there's premature death or unusual death, and we're only taking the part that's attributable to the action to blame on that action, right? We don't expect just because everything dies, that doesn't mean that it was blamable on some particular activity. But cumulative, and that means we don't allow deaths of 1,000 cuts, right? The idea is that we should not allow a whole bunch of small incidental take to wipe out a population necessarily. All right, so why are we at the population level? Well, really, it's because it's really easy to look at, say, biochemistry and tissues and cells and see what their impact in a lab might be, but that's not really relevant, right? We'd like it to be at the level of the ecosystem, and that's where the environmental relevance is greatest, but also where the tractability of the model is lowest. There's the individual, and there's the population, and currently, even now, I think the population level is sort of that sweet spot where you can get something done, basically. And it will necessarily miss some things, but like planets don't interact with each other very much, just the sun, some people argue that like that, species don't really interact with each other very much either. All right. Nevertheless, ecology is complicated, and it's also uncertain. For some species, you could reduce, say, juvenile survivorship by 10%. That would cause the species to go extinct, right? This is true for spotted owls, for instance, or bald eagles. You could drive them to extinction by just reducing juvenile survivorship by a seemingly small amount. For other species, that same impact may have no discernible population level effect. For the salmonids in the Hudson River, you could actually wipe out half the population of the juveniles, 50% mortality, additional mortality. That would have no noticeable effect because they're a dynamic, compensatory species. Right? Ecology also integrates effects too. So suppose that we have observed some effect of some action that has reduced the survivorship, but for some reason it's also increased reproduction. And that's actually been suggested if the plastics that float are surface homes for barnacles and stuff. I can't remember which species it was that does that, but it's conceivable that that's the effect. So if we see these contradictory effects, the ecology, the life history, allows us to integrate them together to ask, is the effect overall positive or is it negative? And to do that, we have to engage in this estimation cycle. So we start with estimating the stress response profile, how many, what the density of plastics is in the ocean is on this axis, or maybe the number of U-shaped sweeping units might be the axis here, whatever the stress you're arguing is. And this is the effect on some demographic rates, some life history relevant numbers. And those life history relevant numbers are composed into the life history and creating a transition matrix that goes through a Monte Carlo engine or other sort of uncertainty propagation engine to create a description of the ecological risk at stake. What's the effect of those impacts on the population level as a whole? And those are expressed, remember, in that ecological risk language, the risk language that we say makes it relevant for decision making. Right? So these ecological risk models basically take things like, well, that life history information includes stuff like the abundance, the time step, and the survival rates, and the fecundity rates, dispersal rates, and the variation in those rates, and maybe something about the density dependence or the carrying capacity, and bolts those all together into a calculation to create both a basis model and an impacted model. Okay? And that's typically life history can be complicated, or maybe not, right? But whatever the, however many dimensions this matrix has to be, you have fecundity on the top row and the subdiagonal there is the survivorships, right? And that matrix is multiplied by the abundance vector, and you get to be able to project this year's abundance to next year's abundance, or this time step's abundance to next time step's abundance, right? So that's the standard way demographers do modeling, right? Whether it's humans or other species, right? But of course, the real world doesn't always collaborate. Those vital rates, those elements in that matrix, we act like they're constants just because we wrote them like that, but of course they're not constants. They fluctuate. They're not fixed in time. What happens numerically if they vary through time, as they always will, because the world is a stochastic place. It's wiggling because of environmental variation. Not just climate change, but weather itself causes changes, right? So we got a population size now. We are expecting that there's some future, right? That future might play out in some way. Population abundance varies through time because sometimes it's a good year, like that first year. Sometimes it's a not good year, like the second year, right? We go up sometimes, we go down sometimes. So is this our prediction? Well, no, because it's time this is time future, right? So we're predicting this, but this was a specific scenario of a sequence of good and bad or whatever years into the future. Of course, we can't predict those because it depends on knowing the weather and knowing things that are really beyond the scope of the model to say. So that is a possible future, but there are other possible futures too. Indeed, there are infinitely many other futures. And really, it's this whole tangle of trajectories, each of which is a possible future that is the prediction of the demographic model, the stochastic demographic model, right? It's this whole tangle of them that's the prediction. If that tangle is going down, as it seems to be doing here, that's presumably an adverse impact. If it's doing something else, it's maybe not so much, right? So any of those trajectories might be the future. The tangle is our prediction, and that tangle, the fact that you've expressed it in this context, allows us to acknowledge that ecological variability is the status of the world. I mean, it's the fact of the world, right? To deny it, to pretend that you can draw that smooth line, that's just a joke. I mean, that's a joke. That's a cartoon. Right? It's this that's the world. So don't get caught in a cartoon. The risk language says, well, even if I know today what's happening, my future prediction has to be a distribution, at least. I mean, it has to be unknown to me. And it's this tail that represents the risk. It's the chance of being below some threshold. That's the risk. That's what we're worried about, right? Nobody's worried if those things sweeping through the ocean are increasing the abundance of Velella, no one might care about that. It's the bottom tail that matters. Okay. So how do we express that tangle of trajectories to get those those risks? Well, there are lots of different ways to do it. You can express them in terms of exceedance probabilities or maybe crossing times. These are the standard ways you express these kinds of risks. The exceedance probabilities include the risk of a population decline of some magnitude, or the chance of a recovery, right, after an impact has stopped. The crossing times might be the time to decline, or the so-called first passage time, right? How long it takes for this population to fall below some level that we're worried about. Or perhaps the time to recovery. That's the inverse of risk. It's the bon chance, the good outcome. Okay. So that tangle, if we look at that tangle and say, each of those trajectories is sort of a replicate possible future, what are the minima associated with each of those trajectories? The minimum of each curve over all that 25 years is highlighted in red. So the distribution of those values, then, is that chance of population decline, right? It's the chance that you fall to some, in this case, percent population decline. So this is extinction, and this is no impact at all. And given that time horizon, which was only 25 years, right? This curve sort of looks like that. There's no chance of extinction over that short time, but there is a chance of decline, and this area represents, that's the unfortunate, that's the risk. It's what bad might happen. But whether that bad that happens is due to our impact is only true in this middle region, right? Because this happened without the impact. Just the risks of being alive include the risk that you might die. So that's going to happen without the impact. It's only this middle bit, the additional or attributable risk, that we can blame on whatever action we're studying. Does that make sense to everybody? That's an attributable risk, and it's expressed in this risk language, which makes things convenient. We could also look at that same tangle of trajectories and say, well, what was the first passage time? Say we're interested in falling below 60 or 50, I don't remember which it is. Looks like 60. So when did each trajectory fall below 60? Well, in this one, it happened almost right away. In this one, it happened somewhere between this year and that year, right? And these happened over here. It looks like all of them fell below 60. Okay? And that population of red points makes this curve, which is the analogous to the first passage time. It's the first time in those however many years that the population falls to a level. It looks like this scale is not relevant to our previous picture, but that's the same plot that you might expect, right? And again, it's compared, there's a base case, and it's compared against the impacted case, and it's the attributable risk inside, which is relevant to ecological risk analysis. Make sense? So these two kinds of risks, and of course you can express that the percentage decline maybe is total numbers, or it's area, or it's percentage decline, and you can swap them around. You can make the curves do different things, but basically it's risks of something bad happening over a specified time horizon, and this is the risks of something happening, of something particularly happening over a not fixed but continuous time, an interval of time, right? So that's how you do risk analysis at the ecological risk analysis at the population level, in very brief terms, obviously. But there's one more wrinkle that brings us to the Risk Institute, and which is important here especially, and that is that there are two kinds of uncertainty. There are two kinds of this not knowing, right? There's the variability, which we've been talking about, that makes the tangle. That's just the natural stochasticity that comes from spatial variation or temporal variation, or including also things like genetic differences or even component differences. If you've got 60 collection vehicles, they're going to be different in different ways. So that is part of that sort of variation. It's the wiggliness of the world. There's also a different kind of thing, a different kind of uncertainty, and that's what I might call incertitude. I'd really call it ignorance, but scientists and engineers get upset or nervous when you talk about their ignorance. So this is a euphemism for, just read ignorance there. I call it incertitude. In French, it means the same thing, right? Incertitude is just lack of perfect knowledge. So that comes from limited sample size or imperfect measurement. imperfect measurements, the plus or minus part, or the use of surrogate data. So, I've got data on, I haven't got data on the wild ducks, but I've got them on chickens, for instance, right? So that kind of extrapolation is another kind of incertitude or ignorance, if you will. But that's a different kind of not knowing than this, right? This can be reduced by better study, by more empirical or better empirical effort. This can't be reduced. You can study it more, but it doesn't go away because you studied it, right? So there are different kinds of uncertainty, and they're projected in the models completely differently. And if you fail to understand that, you'll really screw up your assessment, right? So if we got uncertainty about risk, then, well, this is this is an actual calculation. We're doing this, I think, the spotted owl, which I already mentioned. The spotted owl, I should say that these classifications are from the IUCN criteria. IUCN, of course, stands for World Conservation Union. Okay, it's French, probably. Yeah. So if you're in this, if your risk curve, remember it's like a first passage time problem. So if your risk curve ventures into the critical region, you're critically endangered, according to the IUCN rules. If you're in the endangered box, you're endangered. And if you're outside the vulnerable box, they don't have a word for that, but it means non-vulnerable. It's not endangered. So what did the spotted owl do? It's like, God damn. It just went along here and just oscillated right there. So I'm like, okay, is that vulnerable or is that not vulnerable? It's kind of not perfectly clear. So we said, well, we used all the parameters to build the stochasticity to make that tangle of trajectories. That tangle of trajectories said this. So what we should do the other kind of uncertainty, the ignorance part of uncertainty, right? Because it was based on some data. Let's look at the plus or minus bits, project those through the calculation. And what do you suppose we found? Well, turns out you could do an optimistic interpretation of that measurement uncertainty, and your extinction curves would go like this, just right at zero. There's no chance of being endangered. Or you could take a pessimistic view of that measurement uncertainty and project it on the other side, and it goes like this. It's like, yeah, this is worse than like before, right? Because the uncertainty is this, right? This was our forecast, but this is our uncertainty about that forecast. And so I was talking in Japan, and they said, simultaneous translation, and they said, talk slow and don't tell any jokes. But I did tell a joke, and the joke was, after 100 years, we computed the risk of extinction for the spotted owl to be somewhere between 0 and 1, but we're very confident about those bounds. And they took a few beats to get through the translation, but they actually got it and they started laughing. It's a personal victory. But that uncertainty, and this is the reason I'm at the Risk Institute, it's because of this uncertainty on top of this kind of forecast, right? That's that difference between those two kinds of uncertainty, the two kinds of not knowing, is really critical. And you can't, if I had folded the uncertainty about, the not knowing, if I pretended it was variability rather than incertitude, I would have gotten a completely erroneous result. I wouldn't have understood the fact that I couldn't compute this, right? Of course, I can say that it's over 30 years, we're fine, right? 30 years into the future, that's a good prediction, 30 years into the future. This is based on 8 years of data. 8 years of data, the biologist said, well, you need to project 100 years into the future. Take a regression line of 8 units and project that 100 years, 100 steps out into the future, people would laugh you off the stage, right? But somehow in biology, that's okay. And so we were saying, this is the right answer. Quit pretending that you can make these forecasts into the long term. It just doesn't work. That was the first passage kind of uncertainty. There's also the other kind of uncertainty. That's uncertainty about the risks of decline. So anytime you have an upper and lower bounds on that uncertainty, on that risk, then you can express the uncertainty about it. Again, that's the incertitude about the stochastic risk. All right, so that was sort of a review of what I view as ecological risk assessment. How much time have I used? I don't know. I'm just going to keep going. Tell me when to stop. So I had some general slides about how we stochasticize models, how we take Matt's deterministic model and convert it into a stochastic model that we can do this kind of risk analysis on. And these are just the general idea. So you look at these deterministic predictions and you say, okay, great, but what about the environmental variability that we know exists in the world? There are two ways to sort of project it. You could say that it's like projecting measurement uncertainty, or it's like propagating temporal variability, and you sort of get different pictures. You do it those two different ways. We call that a tangle. We might call this a bouquet, right? To make some evocative words. Those are compared against with the Malthusian or logistic growth that was the sort of the I don't know if I'd even call it best possible, because the deterministic is actually not the same as the mean of either of those curves. So it's hard to call it the best possible. It's just the deterministic picture. There are some surprises when you go to stochasticizing your deterministic model. The first is that the tails are sometimes more important than the means. So even if you did compute the means, that may not be relevant, right? Nobody cares that you've computed the average traffic. What we care about is the traffic during traffic jam time, right? Nobody cares about your average electricity use. We care about the use during the times when we might have blackouts. That's what really matters, what forces people to make different decisions, right? These different uncertainties, the stochasticity, or the wiggliness, compared to the incertitude or the ignorance, they accumulate differently. They're telling different stories. They're really changing the answers back and forth. And the optimal is very different, whether that is noise or the stochasticity or the incertitude. The optimal may be very different when you add either to the deterministic model, right? We've all, well, maybe not all, but probably some of you have heard of the Jensen inequality, right? The idea that a nonlinear function of a mean isn't the mean of that same function. And the bias is usually systematic, right? And Jensen's equality says functions of the expectation or the mean are less than the expectation of the function. And that's true for any convex function. So for the kinds of functions we typically talked about, you see this. And as I sort of indicated earlier, these two kinds of uncertainty project differently. So randomness, the wiggliness, the stochasticity, it kind of self-cancels. It evens out over time. So if you flip an unbiased coin, you sort of expect this kind of propagation of uncertainty as you go into the future. But if you flip a biased coin, then of course, that just keeps accumulating. Right? Biased coins accumulate their biased winnings all the time, and eventually the bias will overwhelm the stochasticity, even though at the beginning it was the noise that was the important bit. Right? That exceedance risk, that tail probability, is composed, what's it say? System response. If you're an engineer, that axis is called the system response variable. And if you're any other human being, it's called a variable. Right? I don't know why, it's just, or the output. I guess these are, I cobbled together 4 different presentations, all of which were hour long, and I cobbled them together into 1.5 hour segment. So thank you, or you're welcome, whatever that joke is. So this is sort of the expected, the sort of the story you get when you start playing around with these kinds of logistic and Malthusian models on a computer. We're going to say, how does this happen when I multiplicatively combine, right? So I'm just taking x now, multiplying it by something, and finding x later. Right? I start out at some point, and the variability of what I'm multiplying are these numbers, and I got 1,000 replicates, and how many time steps? 300 time steps or so. So when the standard deviation is nothing, it's just the deterministic model. But as that standard deviation grows, you get more and more of a different picture altogether. And the effect on the variance of the variance on those tail risks, right? These are the same decline risk, or the risk of population decline that we saw before. Of course, with deterministic models, there is a risk. It's just the chance that it actually hits that level. But the others have, well, the deterministic model sort of doesn't tell you the story of how the effects of variance changes those risks. That's what I'd like to say. And what Jensen inequality doesn't emphasize is that the effects on the median and the tails can be much stronger than those on the mean. Okay. So the take-home lessons about ecological risk assessments are, first, people don't get worked up about mortality, unless it's of humans. And actually, depends on the humans. They may not even get worked up about them, right? We've all seen Trump. But they maybe care about ecosystems because they're economically important, but we can't make predictions about entire ecosystems. It's really the impacts on populations that are more relevant, often because they're resource species, if not for us, for things that we're worried about. We can make predictions about populations, and it's really just accounting, but we have to be probabilistic in our accounting, and we have to tease out the attributable risks and the uncertainty. So I know nothing about Velella, including how to spell it. So I spelled it with an A here and got nothing. I was going, why is there nothing on the interwebs about Velella? But if you put the E in, then suddenly things pop up. And Wikipedia, at least, believes that Velella is a monospecific genus of hydrozoa. And they say that the only known species is Velella. It's a cosmopolitan, free-floating hydrozoan that lives on the surface of the open ocean. I know that Rebecca disagrees with this. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but there may be subspecies or subgenera, as I called it earlier today, on that subject. All over the globe. Pardon?
It drinks gin.
Yeah. Cosmopolitan was the drink was named after the sophistication of being global in your citizenship. Although Cosmos are so much better than almost any other drink. So this is Velella, according to, this is the National Geographic picture, which they said, don't use this picture, we have copyright. But I think that this constitutes fair use, so I'm using it. That's Velella on a beach in Northern California, or Oregon. In fact, I guess it was 2015, there were reportedly billions of them that washed up on the beaches of Oregon, but also Washington and all along California. And they were stranded, of course, by ill winds that sort of blew them onto the shore, and they get washed up and desiccate there. And Kevin Raskoff from Monterey Peninsula College, I don't know that, but he says that these mortalities are not unusual. They happen every 3 to 6 years. I don't know, 3 to 6 makes me think El Nino, La Nina, I don't know. So ill winds cometh, and they killeth offeth Velella. Here's another shot of the beach. And this is another shot of another beach. Maybe it's focused here, but all of this like vaguely blue bit, all of that's Velella, those little tiny organisms. So it's a bad day for the Velella. And this is a picture from the UK, actually, from Wales. Those are all the Velella. There were millions washed ashore here in 2003 and again in 2006. Of course, they're usually found more commonly in warmer waters, according to Wikipedia, but they seem to be becoming more common here, possibly due to climate change. I looked for the conservation status of Velella, and I've never actually seen this sort of, because there are rules about how you say that the IUCN things were not listed, were not evaluated. NE is the formal term for not being evaluated, but just has no special status. I'm not even sure what that means. There is a risk analysis, or a way to do ecological risk analysis at the population level for common species, or indeed abundant species, and we can talk about that. When did we start? Have I been going on and on?
I think 40 minutes.
40 minutes so far? So we can talk about that or not. So maybe I'll skim through real fast. Sorry. Because I presume that they are an abundant species. So we can talk about assessments. 95% of these assessments are screening assessments. And you can use classification systems. One more, I think. Yeah. You can use classification systems, or you could use scalar population models, right? The classification systems are crude, but they're still possible with very little data. In fact, IUCN was designed, they have categories called data deficient, which is the case where you have no data at all. They also, and you sort of characterize an impact as serious if the species jumps categories. That's what we presume. It's not written into law or anything. But it's not obvious. It doesn't provide an obvious way to determine an impact's effect, right? So you have to recompute it with it without, I guess. but there's no sort of accounting for it online. The scalar population models, on the other hand, are still very crude, and they are still possible with minimal data, but they go to the essential elements of risk, and they sort of make explicit what the classification systems were taking implicitly, right? They have an explicit or implicit model of the impact's effects, and they ignore the complexity of the biological population, but they do take account of the population as a whole. So extinction, well, maybe not extinction. It's not, but there could be an increase in the extinction risks. What? So in the previous slides, we were talking about how the extinction risk increase measures the impact. So maybe not extinction. Maybe we should be talking about the risk of the half loss. So the risk of going not to extinction, but to half its current population. Or more generally, to talk about the risks of decline or time to decline or time to recovery at any threshold abundance that you might care about. Right? This is how the IUCN views the world, right? You could be extinct or extinct in the wild, or you could be critically endangered or endangered and vulnerable. That was those pictures I showed you before. Or you could be lower risk. I guess there's a term for it, lower risk, for different reasons. Or it could be data deficient or not evaluated. I've never seen no special status. Maybe I'm old or haven't been paying attention. So multiple presentations slammed together. There's that picture again. The IUCN rules are actually quite complicated. Each category is based on 5 different criteria. The first one is risk, but few people use it. And there are 4 proxies for risk. So there's abundance, fragmentation, and other things. Each criterion is a Boolean expression of a bunch of threshold comparisons. And information is required for at least one criterion for it to hold. But only one criterion is necessary for you to find yourself in one of those slots. This is, for instance, the criteria for critically endangered. So the risk is the first part, the A, is the population reduction of 80% over the last 10 years or 3 generations, or 80% reduction expected within the next 10 years or 3 generations. So the risk language is that first one. These B, C, D, and E are, it looks like that's also the same thing. These things are what was the word? Proxies. They were proxies for the population level risk. Right? The IUCN criteria have been very widely applied. They've been busy little beavers. They've done all the mammals on the planet, all the birds, lots of reptiles and amphibians and fish, but only less than 2,000 invertebrates. So I guess this is and they haven't seemed to have done the Valella, for instance, or other forms, but they've done all the turtles, of course. The advantages are, well, there is a theoretical basis. There's a consensus globally, except, of course, for the United States. They use a slightly different system invented by I think it's the Forest Service. Of course, they've got to be different. But it's essentially the same. It has this practicality element of the proxies, and it's transparent and repeatable. People go all over the world, and they sort of speak the same language, this IUCN language. And these are the scales of impact, 50% in 10 years, and so forth. This is the classifications that let you say that you're in this category. And what we'd like to say for abundant species is to translate those to a human timescale, and that translation assumes that the growth is a random walk around 1, right? So no change. The advantages of such a translation would be that it's the same criteria for all ecosystems, not just the ones involving endangered species. It would be therefore less vulnerable to legal challenge and generalized international standards. And the advantage of going to those simple scalar population models is that, yes, they're crude, but they do work with minimal data, and they go to the essence of the problem, which is the risk problem, and they ignore a lot of the things which are confusing and turn out to be not really terribly important. So you've heard that expression that a seed is just a plant's, I've screwed up the joke. That a plant is just a seed's way of making more seeds, right? That's the joke. But that's not a joke, that's the fact, right? A plant is just a way to make more seeds. And likewise, a medusa may be just a polyp's way of making more polyps. You don't have to go down there and look at it. Now, it's not satisfying to us biologists. We think, oh, I'm an ornithologist. I've watched the fledglings in their nests, and I really care. And I know I've counted all the rates at which they fledge and the rates at which they do these different things. And I want to somehow use that in my population model. But it's silly to do that because it's just a lot of numbers that don't make any difference at the end if you're talking about the census. Right? What makes a difference is R, right? Whether it's a determinate or whether it's a continuous time model or a discrete model, it's really R that makes the difference, right? And it's the uncertainty about R that makes the difference and how it's expressed, right? So think of the M eco-risk screening model that applies not just to endangered species but all species. You think of it as, well, it's just this, or it's discrete analog, where R is some wiggling function of some mean. And that, the wiggle, is maybe white noise or maybe pink noise, if depending on how you feel about the correlations. But this M screening tool, did you want to complain? No? We're fine?
Pink noise.
Oh, pink noise is slightly, white noise is uncorrelated with itself, right? Pink noise is slightly correlated with itself. It's a little in the direction of the red, right? This M screen is quick and easy. You only need empirical estimates for the growth rate, right? The variation in the growth rate, and the population size. And you have to decide things like the crossing threshold and the time horizon. Those aren't empirical. Right, so an example is the striped bass in the Hudson River, which is kind of like Villela, in the sense that there are a whole bunch of them, and possibly a lot of mortality that maybe doesn't affect the total population so much, or the total risk so much. We have these things, these numbers, and it gives us this risk, this 0.0, in this case 0.09 risk. So even though we thought it was going to be a big deal, and it is a big deal if you compare it to other risks, like say fishing, or entrainment in the nuclear power plants, for instance, it's actually not such a big deal on the level of the population. So I think that's the same. And minimal data requirements, as I said. So less to estimate means more believability in the results, hopefully. Monitoring data can estimate the R and the sigma and the N, and we don't need even N if we're just talking about percent decline. So simplifying the model, so doctor, it hurts when I do this. Well, don't do that, right? Simplifying the model means a lot more ease at making estimates. Even poor estimates can be used, and we can use bounding to be conservative, and we don't need to pick a single time horizon, and we don't need to pick a single threshold either. We could do that on scale. So for stationary populations, you also don't need to worry about the density dependence. You can get at least conservative Qs, at least conservative risk estimates, by letting R be 1, and because density independent models, in that case, are conservative. And the M screen is conservative. It's going to overestimate, possibly, but it will never underestimate the risks. Density independence is conservative, and under uncertainty use the worst case, and under trending use the worst case. Otherwise, the Malthusian model is pretty good on average, or certainly in the long run. But it ignores all those things that biologists think are important, and of course are important, but actually don't make a difference in the outcome of the extinction risk analysis or decline risk analysis. There's also a K screen. The M screen is good if you don't have any density dependence or don't know what it is. The K screen is useful if you do know something about dependence. The advantages of these simple scalar models are, the obvious ones, I think. Fully probabilistic, can be done conservatively, are widely accepted and have good credibility because you've not made a lot of assumptions. Okay, so that's the essence of what I wanted to talk about. I know I've annoyed you, and you, probably you. Whom haven't I annoyed? Liars. Okay, so we wanted to say a few words to sort of start the workshop. And I guess, I'm just one voice, but I guess we should sort of keep in mind what we think we're striving for. Are we talking just about understanding it ourselves to figure this stuff out? Are we planning for publications? If so, we should talk about that. And I think maybe we can fix Wikipedia, at least. And I learned after we started this organization, that Simon and Pedro started the organization, I learned afterwards that there are ODA funding opportunities for this question. So, now I'm more interested. Funding. I don't know if you know, but academics are interested in research funding. Who knew? So I think the big holes, for me anyway, and I think that you might agree, the big holes are, are we sure that plastics in the gyres are so bad? Has that been demonstrated? Can we see that in a risk language? Can we see what the impact is, really? And secondly, is Newston, or its mortality, really all that important? I mean, we could kill a lot of Newston and maybe not affect Newston. You know what I mean? And how can we demonstrate the importance of the effect that we're worried about, right? Because everybody can worry. The question is, how can we show that it's right to worry? That's a different question. And really, more generally, is it the physics that's at stake, or is it the biology that's really going to play? Answering those fundamental questions, we all have opinions about all of these, but I'm not sure that we've really nailed it down. I don't think we collectively know, really.
What do you mean by the last one?
Well, can we be talking about just the currents and the assemblage of Newston and plastics in gyres? Is that really the story?
Right.
Or is it really the stochasticity of the biological populations that matters, the impacts, whether it's the turtles that are being impacted by the plastic or the Newston that's being impacted by the sweeping? I don't have a name. What's the right name for this? The big U-shaped. How could I not have the name at this point in the workshop? The big sweeper. Right? Should we call it the slot? Right? It's no. Seems like not a good choice. Okay, so what are the questions that we should be focusing on? Are we doing risk assessments here? Or should we really be doing parameter characterizations? That's what's really needed, to figuring out what the data are saying about those parameter values. Or should we be thinking collectively and hard and in a focused way about the models development? Should we be integrating Megan and Clark's and Matt's models into and maybe other models into one coherent model that we all approve of? Or should we be talking about planning empirical effort? We can't even say anything about the parameter characterization, much less the risk assessment, without doing something serious about the planning of future empirical efforts. Or maybe consolidation, right, Uchenna? Or maybe we shouldn't be worried about that assessment. We should just get to the point of optimizing the design of the sweeper. Or we should worry about this. There are lots of things that we could be talking about. And I'm interested in all of those things, actually. With respect to the modeling, I think there are lots of questions, as Matthew fully explained it, there are lots of questions to address. I think the big ones are we talking about equilibrial models or temporal models? And exactly how are we going to do the spatial variation? That's a real trick. And I think we need to do it in a way that's defensible and relevant. That's a real trick. Okay, and finally, what should we do today? Well, today and tomorrow, maybe just today. Maybe we can make a list of what is known. What do we all agree on? Or maybe almost all of us agree on, since it maybe is a contentious question. And what questions should we be trying to address? And frankly, the big questions with respect to that are, should we be doing risk assessments or engineering or data science, or maybe all three? Maybe we should break up into three groups and do all three things to get something useful. I think that's the end. I have fewer people to thank than Matt because I listen less than Matt does. So I pay attention a lot less than Matt does. So any questions about that? Don't embarrass yourselves.
Yeah, so it sounds like if the population is that sweet spot, then population data is something that we should fold into this discussion about, like, Zalella.
You are mad at me, aren't you?
No, I'm not. I'm sorry. Am I giving off that vibe?
No. What do you mean, the sweet spot?
I'm a little tired. I ate lunch and now I'm very
it was
sleepy.
just a joke. I'm sorry.
Well, so you were talking about molecular biology. It's like easy to know stuff.
Oh, that sweet spot.
Which,
yes.
oh my god, if I'm mad about anything, it's that. So hard to know stuff. But yeah, that the population is like the place that's like the sweet spot to be looking. But then you were talking about Villela, and you were like, this is the species.
No. It could be Villela. I mean, it's Villela, just from your input, seems to be the interesting, or maybe it could be turtles, because their food is Villela, right? So it could be that trophic one step. Or maybe it's, turtles directly impacted by the plastics, right? It doesn't matter to me, which we're doing.
If we get into a
I frankly
turtle
think we should do both.
argument, then I'm like, I might have to call it turtle friend. So I don't know anything about turtles. So I'm just trying to figure out like if population data is the level we need to be aiming for. Because we can talk species data, but I have like an unpublished thesis that has population data. So is that something to inject? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And in my experience, it's usually you need one paper. Often one good paper is enough to get way started, and you can do these ecological risk assessments. I say that to people who are starting their risk assessments, but I actually find it to be true too. So it's not just a lie.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have another question.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I forget who said it, but like there's known knowns, known unknowns, and
Donald
unknown
Rumsfeld.
unknowns. Yes. And he got a lot of shit for it at the time.
No, it's perfectly.
It's great. I think it's really smart. So when you were talking about your two categories,
You're familiar with the Donald Rumsfeld poetry website?
No.
It's a whole website devoted to his poetry, which means things he said that are like this. But that one is a particularly sober one.
Yeah. Well, some broke clock is right twice a day, right? So. In your two categories of ignorance or uncertitude,
incertitude and variability.
Where do those two fall? Like, how do you incorporate known unknowns from unknown unknowns? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, when you decide which it is, we know what to do. There are situations, it's sort of like dividing ice from snow. Yeah. There are situations in which one can become the other. For instance, if you change the question from asking one about the mean of a population to asking about individuals, then one kind of uncertainty becomes the other kind. But typically, especially from far afield, we sort of know the difference, right? We know the difference between an iceberg and snow, especially if it hits you.
That's very true. And so if you are talking about the spotted owl, and you're like, okay, well, there's somewhere between a 100%, 0%, right? It's going to go extinct in the next 100 years. That was based on those risks, right? So that wasn't just like in the universe, there's this probability. It's like based on these risks. Yeah. That was actually
an impacted risk. So we didn't talk about the original risk. The impacted risk was with some forestry activity that was going on at the time.
So then if you say there's a possibility it'll go extinct, but there's a possibility that won't, like what was the takeaway?
The take-home message?
Yeah.
Well, there were two take-home messages in that case. The first one was over those 30 years, it was perfectly clear that the owls were safe.
Okay.
But at the same time, more monitoring is needed because the future is opaque to us now. And those are, I think, really the practical messages that one should take in situations like that.
Okay.
More monitoring. Imagine the biologists say more monitoring is needed. They've never said that before. So you bought all that? Okay. So the rest of the time, as far as I know, is unstructured, and it's up to us to decide what that structure is, if any, or just to have an open discussion. We can maybe address what structure we want at the beginning right now.
I really like this list of practices.
Okay. So we can generalize on
maybe
that.
an open discussion and then recording secretary. Sure.
Oh yes, recording secretary, rapporteur. There should be two, right? Not it.
Well, why can't we just record it?
Can we?
We're recording now. We can just move that microphone into the middle of the crowd. If we stop recording on the presentation and restart it.
Should I?
Well, the presentation's over, so might as well. But restart it.